Now that we have created our financial model in depth, addressing right from the assumptions till the computation of the various financial statements, and then even computing the free cash flows, and finally the IRR of the project. Now, if we have to talk about what next, we are talking about a critical element in the decision making, that is the what if analysis. What if some of our assumptions change? Right? What if some of our assumptions change? So if I want to play around with the assumptions and observe what could be the impact on the project output, that is where we work with the what if analysis using the spreadsheet. Technically also there are two terms associated with this what if analysis. We categorize something as sensitivity analysis, wherein we change one variable, one assumption, and observe the impact on the output which you would like to measure. So, changing only one variable for multiple possibilities and then checking out the impact on the output is what we call as sensitivity analysis. And there is another term called scenario analysis, wherein we'll change multiple inputs, addressing it as a scenario, multiple inputs, and probably look at multiple outputs, what is the kind of impact. So these are the two things we would like to understand using the spreadsheet, how we can do what if analysis without really disturbing our existing model. Now for that, the easiest thing for me to work out is from this assumption sheet, right? Let's say I would take up a scenario that if the interest rates, or probably if the growth rate, I want to see one variable changing. If the growth rate is, we have assumed it as 7%, right? So what if the growth rates are something like this, 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5. So what if the revenue growth is any one of these scenarios? So one assumption, one input value is changed, and based on that I would like to observe what is my output. What is the output I would like to observe? I would like to observe my project IRR. What will happen to my project IRR? So one thing is, I have to pull out my output, whatever I want to observe, probably into this assumption sheet itself. This is what I would like to observe by replacing all these values one by one into my revenue increment. So whenever I have such kind of a scenario wherein one input variable is getting changed and I am observing the impact on the output variable, I am going with the sensitivity analysis, and in Excel the sensitivity analysis is actually performed by a tool called data table. Now the way I will handle it is, I will list out all the possibilities of one single variable which I would like to observe. I am listing them out in a form of a column or a row like this or this. And once I have listed out one cell up and one cell to the right, point out to your output variable. So probably you don't need like this also, you can very well point it out to this output variable called project IRR. Even that you don't need this part also. Right, here itself one cell up and one cell to the right, you highlight your project IRR that you want to track. Then you select this entire area, go to this data table, get into the data table, and because your input is in the form of a column here, you select this column input cell, and once you have selected that, where should this entire input go one after the other? They should get replaced here. So you point to this cell where this replacement has to happen, and you say okay. Now what happens? Across you could see these are your IRRs. In case the growth rate is 6% or 6.5% or 7%, what you could see is your IRR is changing by this kind of project IRR is getting changed by this kind of amounts. So probably when your growth rate is 6 or 6.5, you are getting overall 13% return, whereas when the growth rate is going to 9%, probably you are getting 17.12. Without disturbing your existing model, you are able to create a what if analysis or sensitivity analysis by changing one input variable by a multiple possibilities, and then observing the impact on the output variable. This is what we call as a sensitivity analysis. Then we have another way of doing a what if here called as a scenario analysis. Here my intention is I will observe multiple inputs as well as multiple outputs. Right? I want to change multiple inputs parallelly. So probably I would like to consider something like this: a good economic scenario, or probably a moderate scenario, and probably a bad. In the good, I'll talk about probably my revenues. Right, I'll talk about the revenues growing at 9%. The expenses are probably the inflation is only 3%. And if I want, I can consider any number of variables also. What else could be the variables? I can talk about, we'll take one more, probably the interest rates. I'll take my interest rate as 11%. So these are the three things in a good economy. In a moderate, probably I am thinking of 8% to be the revenues, 5% to be the inflation, and 12% or 12.5% to be the interest rates. And probably in a bad economy, I am thinking of 6% to be my revenues, 7% to be the inflation, and probably the interest rates to be 14%. Now I want to see what would be the impact of these three kind of economies on one project IRR, which I will pull it from here. So I'll take this is my project IRR, and I will also look at the equity IRR. So all of them should be on the same page for me. So I'll pull out this equity. So basically I am changing a few set of variables again and again and looking at their impact on multiple variables, right? Multiple combinations of the input changing, and I am observing the multiple outputs together. This is where I use a scenario analysis, and the typical Excel tool that is solving this purpose is also called as scenario manager. What I would be doing in this process is I'll go to this what if analysis and I pick up the scenario manager, wherein I'll start defining the scenarios. Probably I'll call the scenario name as good. What all fields I need to change? One, the first one is pointing to my revenues. The second one is pointing to my inflation, and the third one is pointing to the interest rates. So by keeping all those things, here the three possibilities I have to do an entry. For those three possibilities, I will be doing an entry saying 9%, 3% and 11%. This is my good scenario. Then I have moderate scenario, wherein rest all I don't change. In the moderate I am selecting 8%, 6%, and probably 12.5%. These are the values. And probably a bad scenario wherein I am selecting 6% for the revenues, 8% for the inflation, and 14% for the interest rates. Whatever it is, you can create as many scenarios as possible, and finally you can look at the summary where you can very well experience that you would like to observe these two parameters. And when I am saying okay, I am going to get a detailed report out of this, which I can use for a very good interpretation purpose. Right, let me just let's look at this output that it has generated. When the revenue increase is 9%, the inflation is 3%, and the interest rate is 11%, the project IRR is 17.4 and the equity IRR is 20.8. Whereas in the moderate scenario, when these go to 8, 6 and 13, it is expected that the project IRR will come down to 15.65%, whereas the equity IRR will be at 17.7. And on the other case, where the bad scenario, revenues are not growing much but the inflation is much higher, in those cases also what you are observing is your project IRR will be at 12.14, whereas the equity IRR is going to be 12.28%. So this is how we can use multiple scenarios, and based on the multiple scenarios come out with our decision aiding kind of possibilities, so that we can very well see what is the best case, what is the worst case, what is the most probable case, which can really be helped out by the what if analysis scenarios of Excel. So once we have generated our model, the what if analysis scenarios that we are generating something like this, they help us out in creating the various possible outcomes out of various possible input values of our model, which help us in taking very good decisions, right? I hope this has given you some level of basic insight in terms of using the sensitivity and the scenario analysis to do what if picturization on your data. If you have any further queries regarding the same, you can very well get back to me by giving me a call on this number, or even sending an email at vamsidhar@pacegurus.com. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.